Rihanna almost didn't make it home that night. At 2:30 a.m. in 2009, the most powerful rising star in pop music was trapped inside a stopped car, with nowhere to run and no cameras to protect her. By morning, her injuries were public. Her fear wasn't. She was 20 years old, at the absolute peak of fame, and the world learned about her pain before she had time to process it herself. This wasn't a scandal. It was a near ending. Everything after, the empire, the billions, the control, was built on surviving what should have destroyed her. But how does someone learn to survive like that so young, and why did silence feel safer than asking for help? The night did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural. At 2:30 a.m., the car stopped, not because the night was ending, but because control had already shifted. There were no witnesses, no stage lights, no exits. Inside the car, fear did not scream. It narrowed. Breaths shortened. Time stretched. The body focused on one task only, getting through the next second. When the doors finally opened, the danger had passed, but the damage had already settled in. By morning, the images existed. They moved faster than shock, faster than memory, faster than consent. The world saw injuries, but it did not see dissociation. It did not see how trauma fractures time, how moments lose sequence, how silence becomes physical, how the body complies when the mind disconnects. At 20 years old, she was expected to understand what had just happened to her. To explain it. To control it. Instead, she was asked to manage perception. Headlines appeared within hours. Judgment followed within days. Context never caught up. What the public witnessed was not a private moment of recovery, but the beginning of exposure. Every movement was watched. Every decision interpreted. Every silence questioned. Why didn't she speak? Why didn't she leave sooner? Why wasn't survival convincing enough? Those questions ignored a critical truth. The most dangerous moment is not during violence, it is immediately after it. Fear does not resolve itself when danger stops. It recalibrates. Trust collapses inward. Identity fractures. And the body enters a state designed to endure, not to explain. This was not just a public incident. It was a psychological rupture. What happened that night did not interrupt her life. It rewired it. From that moment forward, every choice would be made with an understanding learned too early. Visibility does not equal protection, fame does not guarantee safety, and survival is often mistaken for strength. This was the moment everything split, not into success and failure, but into before and after. But what shaped her response so deeply that night, and why did silence feel safer than escape? Long before the world knew her name, Rihanna learned a different kind of awareness. She grew up in Barbados, in a home where stability was inconsistent and calm could disappear without warning. Her childhood was not defined by spectacle or extremes, but by unpredictability, the kind that trains a child to stay alert even in quiet moments. Her father struggled with addiction. Alcohol and drugs shaped the atmosphere of the household, not constantly, but often enough to make peace feel temporary. Arguments did not follow schedules. Tension did not announce itself clearly. It arrived suddenly, escalated quickly, and left behind a silence that felt heavier than noise. As a child, she learned to read rooms before entering them. She learned how to measure tone, how to anticipate mood, how to stay still when emotions around her became volatile. This was not emotional maturity. It was adaptation. Home did not always feel unsafe, but it rarely felt predictable. And unpredictability teaches one lesson very early: control is not guaranteed, so attention becomes protection. Her parents' relationship fractured slowly, then publicly. The separation was not just emotional, it reshaped her understanding of security. Love, in her earliest experience, was something that could change without notice. Affection could coexist with fear. Presence did not always mean safety. At school, she appeared composed. Teachers and peers saw a quiet, observant girl, talented, polite, contained. What they did not see was how much effort containment required. Emotions were regulated internally, not expressed externally. Crying was private. Fear was managed alone. Music entered her life as structure. Singing was not just expression, it was control. Rhythm followed rules. Melody offered boundaries. In music, feelings could exist without consequence. They could rise and fall safely, without escalating into conflict. But trauma does not disappear when a child finds an outlet. It reorganizes itself. It shapes attachment. It influences tolerance. It quietly adjusts what feels normal. By her early teens, Rihanna had already learned something many adults never fully articulate: staying calm keeps situations from getting worse. Silence reduces risk. Endurance can look like strength. When opportunity arrived, it did not arrive gently. Leaving Barbados at a young age meant leaving familiarity before identity had fully formed. She entered a new environment where authority was unquestioned, expectations were high, and emotional needs were secondary to performance. Once again, adaptability became survival. The industry praised professionalism. It rewarded composure. It moved quickly. There was little room for hesitation, and even less for vulnerability. Patterns formed early. When pressure increased, she did not collapse outward. She collapsed inward. When boundaries blurred, she did not resist immediately. She adjusted. When discomfort appeared, she learned to endure it quietly rather than disrupt momentum. None of this was conscious choice. It was conditioned response. By the time fame accelerated, the foundation was already set. Her nervous system was trained for endurance, not confrontation. For adaptation, not escape. For silence, not interruption. So when the world later asked why she didn't leave immediately, or why she didn't speak sooner, they were asking the wrong question. The real question was not about one night. It was about a lifetime of learning that staying still was safer than moving, and that surviving quietly was often the only option presented. If silence had protected her once before, how could she have known it wouldn't protect her again? And what happens when that lesson follows you into fame? Opportunity arrived fast, and it did not wait for readiness. In her mid-teens, Rihanna left Barbados with more uncertainty than protection. The move was abrupt. One environment disappeared, another took its place, and momentum filled the gaps where reflection might have lived. There was no gradual adjustment period, no emotional decompression. The industry does not pause for adolescence. Early success created a dangerous illusion. Because she appeared confident, people assumed she was secure. Because she adapted quickly, they assumed she was resilient. But adaptation is not the same as safety, and resilience does not mean immunity. The first recordings, the first performances, the first public appearances all followed a similar pattern. Adults made decisions. Schedules filled. Expectations multiplied. Professionalism was praised. Compliance was rewarded. And questions were rarely invited. She learned the rules quickly. Be reliable. Be agreeable. Don't slow the process. Don't disrupt momentum. Don't appear uncertain. Vulnerability was not discouraged explicitly, it was simply impractical. The power imbalance was subtle but constant. She was young, replaceable, and still defining who she was. The people around her were older, established, and in control of access. They shaped environments. They set terms. They decided what was normal. Fame accelerated before identity stabilized. Her public image was carefully constructed. Confident. Fearless. Controlled. The narrative emphasized strength, independence, and self-possession. It was convincing because it was partially true. On stage, she performed control with precision. In interviews, she spoke with composure. In photos, she looked unbothered. But performance has limits. Behind the scenes, emotional development lagged behind exposure. She was learning how to navigate contracts, expectations, and constant visibility while still carrying unprocessed childhood patterns. Patterns that normalized unpredictability. Patterns that equated endurance with safety. Success did not remove vulnerability. It disguised it. As her visibility grew, so did the pressure to maintain consistency. There was less tolerance for hesitation. Less patience for boundaries. The machine required output, not introspection. And because she had learned early that staying calm prevented escalation, she complied. Not because she lacked agency, but because agency had never been modeled safely. Relationships formed within this environment were shaped by imbalance from the start. Fame complicated everything. Public scrutiny distorted perception. Control could be reframed as care. Intensity could be mistaken for passion. And warning signs could be dismissed as side effects of success. When discomfort surfaced, it did not announce itself clearly. It blended into routine. Long days. Exhaustion. Emotional confusion. None of it looked dramatic enough to stop the process. The industry moved forward. So did she. From the outside, this looked like ascension. From the inside, it felt like acceleration without brakes. There was no time to question dynamics or reassess boundaries. Momentum replaced discernment. By the time her name became global, the foundation beneath it was already fragile. She had learned how to perform strength before learning how to protect herself. She had learned how to stay before learning how to leave. And she had learned how to survive attention without ever being taught how to remain safe within it. This is what fame too young often does. It compresses growth. It rewards compliance. It disguises risk as opportunity. So when the world later asked why warning signs were missed, or why boundaries weren't enforced earlier, they overlooked the most important factor. The system did not fail suddenly. It functioned exactly as designed. And when pressure finally exceeded what endurance could absorb, collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a matter of timing. When success trains you to endure instead of question, how do you recognize danger before it becomes unavoidable? Fame arrived fully formed. By her late teens, Rihanna was no longer a rising artist. She was a fixture. Her voice was everywhere. Her image was carefully reinforced. Tours expanded. Schedules tightened. Expectations hardened into routine. Success became constant, and constancy removed the margin for error. The public narrative emphasized control. She was described as confident, composed, fearless. The image worked because it aligned with what people wanted to believe. Strength is easier to admire than vulnerability. Stability is easier to market than uncertainty. On stage, she delivered precision. The performances were sharp, deliberate, unhesitating. She learned how to command space, how to dominate attention, how to remain unflinching under pressure. Applause followed. Approval reinforced the behavior. Off stage, the pace never slowed enough to assess the cost. Warning signs rarely appear as alarms. They appear as inconveniences. Fatigue. Emotional confusion. Heightened intensity in private spaces that feel separate from public life. When momentum is rewarded, those signs are easy to dismiss. There were moments of discomfort that did not fit the narrative. Moments that felt disproportionate. Emotional shifts that were explained away as stress, as passion, as the side effects of fame. Because fame itself became the excuse. When something felt wrong, the environment offered rationalizations. This is normal at this level. This is what success requires. This is just pressure. Everyone goes through this. And because Rihanna had already learned to normalize instability, those explanations sounded familiar. They did not feel alarming. They felt expected. The higher she rose, the narrower her emotional margin became. Public strength left little room for private doubt. Any expression of uncertainty risked being misinterpreted as weakness, ingratitude, or inability to handle success. So she adjusted again. She learned how to contain discomfort without addressing it. How to separate public performance from private reality. How to compartmentalize fear so it wouldn't interrupt productivity. This was not denial. It was efficiency. Relationships within this context became increasingly complex. Fame distorted boundaries. Attention intensified dynamics. Control could masquerade as concern. Emotional volatility could be reframed as intensity. And because the world saw her as powerful, it assumed she was protected. But power in public does not guarantee safety in private. There were moments when her circle tightened. When access became limited. When emotional isolation increased. These shifts were subtle. They did not trigger alarms. They were interpreted as the natural evolution of a high-profile life. From the outside, everything looked stable. From the inside, pressure accumulated quietly. She was praised for handling everything so well. For staying composed. For not letting success change her. What no one acknowledged was how much effort composure required. Strength became a role she could not step out of. Once that role was established, deviation felt dangerous. The cost of disrupting momentum seemed higher than the cost of endurance. So the warning signs remained unaddressed. Not because they were invisible, but because acknowledging them would have required slowing down, questioning dynamics, and introducing uncertainty into a system that rewarded forward motion at all costs. By the time tension escalated beyond what could be contained, the structure that had supported her success offered no protection. It had never been designed to. The world would later focus on a single night, a single incident, a single image. But collapse rarely begins in one moment. It begins when warning signs are absorbed instead of examined, and when survival skills learned early are mistaken for strength rather than signals. And when endurance becomes the default response, the line between resilience and risk quietly disappears. When everyone believes you are strong enough to handle anything, who notices when handling it is no longer safe? The collapse did not begin with a scream. It began with pressure that had nowhere left to go. In the weeks leading up to February 2009, life moved at full speed. Public appearances continued. Commitments stacked. There was no pause built into the schedule, no buffer for recalibration. Momentum remained the priority. And momentum, once established, is difficult to interrupt. That night unfolded without ceremony. At 2:30 a.m., a car stopped on a dark road. Not as an ending, but as a threshold. Inside that confined space, the protections associated with fame disappeared. No staff. No distance. No audience. The environment compressed choices until there were none left. Time behaved differently there. Seconds stretched. Breaths shortened. The body shifted into calculation mode, not resistance. Survival narrowed to immediacy: stay still, minimize escalation, get through the next moment. This is not passivity. It is physiology. When danger escalates rapidly, the nervous system does not consult logic. It prioritizes continuation. The goal is not victory. It is endurance. By the time the car doors opened again, the threat had passed, but the imprint remained. Trauma does not ask for permission to settle in. It arrives fully formed. Within hours, law enforcement entered the narrative. Within the same window, privacy vanished. By morning, images existed that would travel faster than any explanation she could have offered. The sequence mattered. Exposure arrived before understanding. Interpretation arrived before consent. At 20 years old, she was not navigating recovery. She was navigating aftermath. Shock had not resolved. Fear had not receded. The body was still recalibrating to a world that no longer felt predictable. And yet, expectations resumed immediately. There were questions to answer. Decisions to make. Optics to manage. Silence to explain. But trauma does not operate on deadlines. The mind fragments under sudden threat. Memory becomes unreliable. Emotional processing lags behind physical response. The body remains alert long after danger has ended. This is the stage most people never see. Not the incident itself, but the disorientation that follows. The period when reality feels unstable, when trust collapses inward, when every option feels equally unsafe. Leaving is not always clarity. Speaking is not always relief. Movement can increase danger. Stillness can feel safer. What happened that night did not exist in isolation. It collided with years of learned endurance. With patterns that prioritized containment over confrontation. With instincts shaped by earlier instability. By the time dawn arrived, the incident had already been reframed by the outside world. Headlines condensed complexity into certainty. Context was replaced with conclusion. What remained for her was not resolution. It was exposure layered on top of shock. And the most dangerous part had not yet begun. Because the moment after violence is not the moment healing starts. It is the moment fear learns new rules. When the world sees only the outcome and not the process, what happens to the person still trapped inside the aftermath? When the images reached the public, control shifted again. This time, not behind closed doors, but everywhere. By morning, photographs were circulating faster than facts. By midday, commentary replaced context. And within days, the narrative hardened into certainty. The world reacted to what it could see, not to what it could not understand. What people saw were injuries. What they did not see was dissociation. Trauma rarely looks like clarity. It looks like confusion. It fractures memory. It disrupts sequence. It blurs cause and effect. But public judgment has little patience for uncertainty. Questions arrived immediately. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she speak? Why didn't she act sooner? These questions were framed as logic, but they ignored biology. The most dangerous moment is not during violence. It is immediately after. Fear does not disappear when danger ends. It recalibrates. The nervous system remains alert. Decisions narrow. Options feel unsafe in different ways. Movement can feel riskier than stillness. Silence can feel protective. This is not weakness. It is survival physiology. But survival physiology does not translate well in headlines. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Distance was mistaken for indifference. Complexity was flattened into blame. The burden quietly shifted from accountability to endurance. Instead of being allowed to process shock, she was expected to perform recovery. To offer clarity she did not yet possess. To manage optics while her nervous system was still in crisis. The industry resumed without hesitation. Schedules returned. Obligations remained. Appearances were discussed. Because trauma does not pause commerce, and visibility does not come with recovery time built in. This created a second collapse. Not the violence itself, but the aftermath layered on top of it. Privacy disappeared. Control eroded. Every choice carried consequences beyond safety. Speaking risked distortion. Silence invited speculation. Either option came with cost. Inside, trust had already fractured. Outside, she was asked to explain that fracture in real time. What followed was not healing. It was containment. Armor replaced openness. Distance replaced vulnerability. Composure became necessary, not authentic. The goal was no longer recovery. It was function. She adapted again, using the same tools she had learned early in life. Endurance. Silence. Compliance when disruption felt more dangerous than staying. The world mistook this for strength. But strength was not what was happening. What was happening was survival under observation. This is the part most stories skip. The phase where trauma is no longer acute, but not yet processed. Where the body is functioning, but the self feels fragmented. Where identity becomes defensive rather than expressive. By the time public interest moved on, the damage had already been internalized. Not as a single memory, but as a new operating system. One that prioritized control, distance, and self-protection above all else. The violence ended that night. The collapse did not. It extended into months. Into choices made under pressure. Into an identity reshaped around containment rather than openness. And while the world debated what she should have done differently, she was learning something else entirely. That recovery would not come from explanation. It would come from reclaiming control on her own terms. When survival is constantly misread as strength, how do you begin healing without first losing yourself? The turning point did not arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as distance. There was no public announcement, no dramatic confession, no moment that signaled closure. What changed first was access. She began to limit who could reach her, who could speak for her, and who could define her narrative. This was not retreat. It was recalibration. Silence became intentional. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of boundaries. She stopped explaining herself to audiences that demanded performance instead of understanding. She stopped negotiating pain for approval. The expectation to be transparent was replaced with a decision to be protected. Her work began to shift accordingly. The music grew darker, sharper, less concerned with being palatable. Emotion was no longer filtered for comfort. Control moved from image to intent. This was not rebellion. It was alignment. Healing did not look inspirational. It did not follow a clean arc. There were no guarantees of progress. Recovery came in fragments, not milestones. Distance before clarity. Structure before softness. Therapy did not trend. Privacy did not sell. But both rebuilt something internal that visibility had eroded. Trust was redefined, not as closeness, but as consistency. Relationships were evaluated by how they handled boundaries, not how intensely they demanded access. Space became safety. This was the first time control belonged entirely to her. Not the control of performance, but the control of choice. Choice over exposure. Choice over pace. Choice over what parts of her life were no longer public property. The armor did not disappear. It evolved. What once existed to endure danger now existed to prevent it. Distance was no longer defensive. It was deliberate. Silence was no longer reactive. It was selective. This was not erasure of the past. It was containment without suppression. For the first time since fame arrived, she was not surviving expectations. She was defining limits. Not loudly. Not visibly. But decisively. The world interpreted this shift in different ways. Some called it cold. Others called it detached. But detachment was not the goal. Stability was. The most important change was invisible. Fear no longer dictated direction. Trauma no longer set the pace. Control was no longer something to regain after being taken. It was something she chose to keep. This was the rebirth most people never recognize, because it does not announce itself. It happens quietly, when survival finally gives way to agency. But what happens after agency is reclaimed, when power no longer comes from endurance, but from ownership? Power no longer came from being seen. It came from being owned. After survival gave way to agency, Rihanna did not rush back into visibility. She did not attempt to rewrite the past or soften its edges. Instead, she restructured her relationship with exposure itself. Music became a choice, not an obligation. Presence became intentional, not expected. This was not withdrawal. It was control. What followed surprised an industry accustomed to noise. She shifted from being the product to being the architect. Decisions were no longer reactive. They were strategic. And the strategy was simple: nothing would exist without her consent. Fenty did not emerge as a celebrity extension. It emerged as a correction. The beauty industry had spent decades narrowing the definition of who belonged. Skin tones were filtered. Body types excluded. Standards enforced quietly but relentlessly. Rihanna did not challenge that system with slogans. She dismantled it through structure. Inclusion was not framed as messaging. It was implemented as default. Models were not tokenized. Shade ranges were not symbolic. Visibility was redistributed without apology. And the industry adjusted, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. This was power expressed without explanation. She did not rebrand resilience. She normalized boundaries. Where fame once exposed her to harm, ownership now insulated her. Privacy became a resource. Distance became leverage. Silence became authority. The absence of constant presence did not weaken her influence. It sharpened it. For many women watching, the lesson was subtle but decisive. You do not owe accessibility to be relevant. You do not owe pain to be believed. And you do not need to relive trauma publicly to prove that it shaped you. Rihanna's legacy moved beyond music long before the public noticed. It lived in the refusal to perform recovery. In the rejection of narratives that demanded transformation as entertainment. In the decision to grow without spectacle. She did not return to the world healed. She returned self-directed. This distinction matters. Healing suggests completion. Direction suggests continuity. One implies an end. The other allows evolution. Her impact is not defined by how much she endured, but by what she changed afterward. Systems shifted. Standards expanded. Power was reallocated. Not loudly. Not performatively. But permanently. When power no longer comes from surviving what broke you, but from deciding what you will never tolerate again, what does that make possible next? Rihanna's story is often summarized as triumph. That summary is incomplete. What defined her life was not the rise, nor the collapse, but the long stretch in between, the part where survival was mistaken for strength, and silence was confused with acceptance. The world remembers the headlines. It rarely remembers the cost of continuing afterward. She did not rebuild by erasing what happened. She rebuilt by refusing to let it dictate her future. There was no grand declaration of healing, no moment designed for applause. Recovery was not performed. It was protected. The most important decision she made was not about music, business, or fame. It was about access. Who was allowed close? What was no longer negotiable? Which parts of her life were never again open for consumption? Strength, in her case, did not look like standing taller. It looked like stepping back. Choosing distance over damage. Ownership over explanation. Her legacy is not resilience alone. It is permission. Permission to leave without clarifying every detail. Permission to change without approval. Permission to survive quietly in a world that demands spectacle. Because sometimes the bravest act is not recovery as performance, but continuation without apology. Rihanna did not become powerful by enduring everything. She became powerful by deciding what she would never endure again. And that decision reshaped everything that followed. The story does not end with success. It ends with agency. So the question is not what she survived, or how much she lost along the way. The question is simpler, and far more personal. When the moment that should have ended you finally passes, who do you choose to become, and what parts of your life do you take back as your own? So, what's your story?